Two people can eat the same food, sleep the same hours, live in the same neighborhood, and still age in completely different ways. One stays sharp at 70, while the other begins falling apart at 55. Researchers believe one hidden biological factor may explain why. And once you see it, you may never look at your own blood type the same way again. If you're serious about taking better care of your health, make sure you subscribe. I share simple, practical advice designed especially for seniors, and feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I appreciate every one of you. Let's get back to it. You already know the usual list. Eat better, move more, sleep longer, manage your stress, cut the sugar, watch the sodium. And if you are the kind of person who watches videos like this one, chances are you have already been doing most of those things. You have been paying attention. You have been trying. So why do some people do everything right and still feel like their body is aging faster than it should? Why does one person hit 65 and still feel sharp, energetic, and in control, while someone else the same age, with similar habits, is exhausted by noon, foggy by evening, and collecting diagnoses like they are inevitable? Most doctors will point to the obvious variables, but there is a group of researchers who have been asking a quieter question for years. What if one of the most significant factors shaping how you age was never on that list to begin with? What if it was already inside you, fixed, biological, present from the moment you were born, and almost nobody ever told you it mattered? Your blood type. Now, before you dismiss that, understand that this is not about the blood type diet. This is not internet mythology or alternative health folklore. This is about what long-term population research has actually found. When scientists tracked thousands of people over decades and looked at who developed cardiovascular disease, who showed early cognitive decline, who carried higher inflammatory loads, and who aged with far less biological resistance than their peers, the data keeps circling back to the same variable, a BO blood group. A study published in Arteriosclerosis, Thrombosis, and Vascular Biology identified that non-O blood types carried measurably higher cardiovascular risk, connected to a clotting protein called von Willebrand factor, which your blood type directly influences, and which affects how your circulation performs under pressure across an entire lifetime. Not for a week, not during one stressful event, across decades. And cardiovascular strain is only one piece of it. Researchers have also examined how blood type connects to immune system aging, inflammatory patterns, metabolic efficiency, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, the microscopic vascular changes in the brain that begin long before a single symptom ever appears. This is not about scaring you. It is about something far more useful than fear. Because here is what the research consistently shows, and what most of this conversation gets completely backwards. Your blood type does not determine your fate. What it does is reveal the specific terrain your body has been navigating your entire life, the particular systems most likely to wear down first, the places where silent damage tends to build before anyone notices it. And once you understand that terrain, you stop guessing. You stop applying generic health advice designed for no one in particular. You start making decisions built around how your body actually works. That is the conversation we are having tonight. Most people think about longevity the wrong way. They think about it as a finish line. How far can I go? How many years can I add? How do I avoid dying too soon? But that is not actually the right question. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that researchers in aging science have been sitting with for years. Living longer and aging well are not the same thing. There are people in their late 70s who are mentally sharp, physically functional, and genuinely present in their own lives. And there are people in their early 60s who are already losing ground, exhausted in ways that sleep does not fix, inflamed in ways that diet alone does not resolve, mentally slower in ways that feel frightening, but get explained away as just getting older. The calendar says one thing. The biology says something completely different. So the real question was never how long. It was always, what breaks first? Because aging is not a uniform process. It does not wear the body down evenly like weather eroding a flat surface. It finds weak points. It exploits them slowly, quietly, over years, sometimes over decades, before anything dramatic enough to notice finally surfaces. For some people, the weak point is the cardiovascular system, arterial walls stiffening, blood pressure climbing, the heart working harder every year to push blood through vessels that are gradually losing their flexibility. For others, it is the immune system, slowly losing its precision, becoming either overactive, attacking the body's own tissue, or underactive, leaving the door open to infections and inflammatory conditions that compound over time. For others still, it is the brain, not through one catastrophic event, but through something far quieter. Tiny vessels, microscopic circulation. The kind of vascular aging that researchers now understand begins in midlife, sometimes earlier, long before memory problems or cognitive slowing ever become noticeable. This process even has a name in the scientific literature: inflammaging. It describes the low-grade, chronic inflammatory state that accumulates in the body as we age, and which researchers now believe is one of the primary drivers behind nearly every major disease of aging: cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, metabolic dysfunction, autoimmune conditions, not dramatic, not sudden, just relentless. And here is what makes this relevant to everything we are discussing tonight. Your biological age and your chronological age are not the same number. A 58-year-old with decades of unchecked inflammation, endothelial dysfunction, and elevated cortisol can be biologically closer to 75, while someone else the same age, who understood their vulnerabilities early and worked with them, may be tracking closer to 48. That gap is not fate. It is information acted on, or ignored. And what determines where your body tends to break down first? That is where your blood type enters the conversation in a way that most people have never considered. Because the research does not just tell us that blood types differ, it tells us exactly where each one tends to wear thin. Let's start with the most common blood type on the planet, type O. And if you are type O, the first thing you will find in the research is something that genuinely sounds like good news. Because in many ways, type O blood appears to be the most cardiovascularly resilient of all the blood groups. Here is why that matters. Your blood contains proteins that regulate clotting, how quickly your blood thickens, and how efficiently it moves through your vessels under pressure. One of the most significant of these proteins is called von Willebrand factor, and study after study has shown that type O individuals carry measurably lower levels of it compared to every other blood group. Lower von Willebrand factor means lower clotting tendency. Lower clotting tendency means cleaner circulation. And cleaner circulation, sustained over decades, is one of the most powerful predictors of cardiovascular longevity that researchers have ever identified. A large-scale analysis published in Arteriosclerosis, Thrombosis, and Vascular Biology confirmed what multiple smaller studies had already been pointing toward: that non-O blood types faced significantly higher rates of coronary artery disease compared to type O individuals, with clotting biology identified as a central mechanism. So, on the surface, type O looks like the longevity winner: better circulation, stronger cardiovascular profile, lower arterial risk. And for a long time, that was roughly where the conversation stopped. But science has a way of complicating the stories that seem too clean, because the same biological efficiency that appears to protect the type O cardiovascular system comes attached to a vulnerability that most type O individuals never connect to their blood at all: the digestive system, specifically a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. H. pylori is one of the most common bacterial infections in the world. It colonizes the stomach lining, disrupts the mucosal barrier, and over time creates the conditions for chronic gastric inflammation, ulcers, and in some cases, more serious gastrointestinal complications. And research has consistently shown that type O individuals are significantly more susceptible to H. pylori infection than other blood groups. The reason comes down to surface chemistry. Type O red blood cells carry specific antigens that H. pylori bacteria appear to bind to more effectively, making the type O stomach a more hospitable environment for the infection to take hold and persist. What does that mean in practical terms? It means a type O person can spend decades assuming they are fundamentally healthy, because their heart is strong, their circulation is clean, their cardiovascular markers look good. while silent inflammation is quietly building in their gut the entire time. Bloating dismissed as a food sensitivity. Discomfort explained away as stress. Low-level digestive dysfunction normalized as just the way things are, until it isn't low-level anymore. This is the pattern that appears again and again in blood type research. Every biological advantage carries a trade-off somewhere else in the system. Type O gets a stronger heart, but a more vulnerable stomach. And the danger is not the vulnerability itself. The danger is never knowing it was there. Because the people who age hardest are almost never the ones who face the most risk. They are the ones who carried risk they never understood, and therefore never addressed, until the damage had already been building quietly for years. Type O is built for survival, but survival and thriving are two different things, and knowing which system needs your attention changes everything about how you protect it. Now here is where the conversation shifts. Because if Type O's hidden vulnerability lives in the gut, quiet, slow, easy to dismiss, then Type A's vulnerability lives somewhere most people never think to look. Not in the stomach, not even in the heart directly, in the body's response to pressure. Type A individuals, according to a growing body of research, appear to carry immeasurably more reactive stress biology than other blood groups. Higher baseline cortisol levels, a cardiovascular system that responds more intensely to psychological and physical stressors. Clotting activity that runs higher than Type O, which, sustained over years, creates a very different kind of arterial environment. And here is the part that most people completely miss. Stress is not an emotional problem. It is a physiological one. When cortisol, your body's primary stress hormone, stays chronically elevated, it does not just make you feel tense or irritable. It actively remodels your biology. It damages the inner lining of your blood vessels. It drives up blood pressure. It increases insulin resistance. It accelerates the inflammatory aging process that we discussed earlier. And it does all of this silently. No obvious symptoms. No dramatic warning signs. Just decades of low-grade biological erosion happening beneath the surface while life continues normally above it. Think about two Type A individuals. Same blood type, same genetic starting point. One of them has spent 30 years in a high-pressure career, sleeping 5 or 6 hours a night, absorbing stress like it is a badge of competence, never fully recovering between demands. The other one carries the same blood type, but learned early to protect recovery, manage pressure deliberately, and treat rest as a non-negotiable biological requirement rather than a luxury. At 65, those two people will not look like the same person, biologically, not even close. Because here is what the research tells us about chronic cortisol over a lifetime. A study examining stress hormones and cardiovascular aging found that prolonged cortisol elevation was directly associated with endothelial dysfunction, the gradual loss of the blood vessel lining's ability to regulate circulation effectively. And endothelial dysfunction is not a minor inconvenience. It is one of the earliest measurable stages on the road toward hypertension, arterial disease, and cardiovascular events. For Type A individuals, that road may have a lower threshold to cross. The reactivity is already built in, which means the margin for chronic unmanaged stress is narrower than it is for other blood groups. And that changes the stakes entirely. Not because Type A is a death sentence. It absolutely is not. But because the lifestyle decisions that a Type A person can afford to ignore in their 40s have a compounding biological cost that arrives, without apology, in their 60s and 70s. There are people watching this right now who have spent decades normalizing a stress load that their biology was never designed to carry indefinitely. Subscribe now, because what you learn in the next few minutes may be the first time anyone has explained why your body has been responding the way it has for years. And not knowing that is a cost you keep paying, whether you realize it or not. So far, we have talked about two very different kinds of biological vulnerability. Type O, where the danger hides in the digestive system beneath the cover of a strong cardiovascular profile. Type A, where the danger lives in stress biology, in the slow physiological cost of a system that runs hotter and reacts harder than it was designed to sustain indefinitely. Both of those vulnerabilities share something in common. They are quiet, they are gradual, and they are almost perfectly designed to be mistaken for something else entirely. Type B follows the same pattern, but the system at risk is different, and in some ways, the story is more unsettling, because type B is genuinely, measurably flexible. That is not a myth or an oversimplification. Researchers examining metabolic and dietary adaptability across blood groups have consistently noted that type B individuals appear to tolerate a broader range of nutritional environments than most other blood types. Their systems seem to adjust, to compensate, to find equilibrium across conditions that might stress other biologies more severely. On the surface, that sounds like an advantage, and it is, up to a point. But here is what flexibility in one system can quietly cost in another: the immune system. Your immune system is not designed to be infinitely adaptable. It is designed to be precise. It learns the difference between what belongs in your body and what does not. It builds that map over years, cataloging threats, memorizing responses, maintaining clear boundaries between self and non-self. And in some type B individuals, that precision appears to come under pressure in ways that researchers are still working to fully understand. What the data has shown, across multiple studies examining autoimmune disease prevalence across blood groups, is that type B individuals carry elevated associations with certain autoimmune conditions. Conditions where the immune system does not simply weaken, it turns. It begins identifying the body's own tissue as the enemy, and it attacks accordingly. Now here is what makes autoimmune aging so particularly difficult to catch. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a single dramatic event that sends you to the emergency room. It moves the way fog moves, slowly, gradually, until one day you realize you cannot see clearly anymore, and you cannot pinpoint exactly when the visibility disappeared. Joint stiffness that gets explained as age, fatigue that gets normalized as the cost of a busy life, inflammatory flares that come and go without a pattern anyone can identify, a thyroid that starts underperforming, digestion that becomes unpredictable, energy that never quite fully returns after illness. Each symptom, on its own, seems manageable. Collectively, they are the immune system losing its ability to distinguish friend from enemy, and paying for that confusion, one tissue at a time. Research published across rheumatology and immunology literature has identified associations between type B blood and elevated risk for conditions like lupus and certain inflammatory joint diseases. Conditions where immune dysregulation is not a side effect, but the central mechanism of damage. And the tragedy is not the vulnerability itself. The tragedy is how long most people carry these symptoms before anyone connects them to a systemic immune pattern rather than isolated, unrelated complaints. Years, sometimes decades, of fatigue normalized, of inflammation managed symptom by symptom instead of addressed at its root. Type B's greatest biological strength, adaptability, can quietly mask the early signals of a system that is beginning to lose its precision. And a system that has lost its precision does not recover on its own. It compounds, slowly, silently, exactly the way the most dangerous kinds of biological damage always do. Every blood type we have discussed so far has followed the same basic pattern, a strength, a shadow beneath it, a vulnerability hiding exactly where you would least expect to find one. Type O, powerful circulation, exposed gut. Type A, sharp and driven, paying a biological tax on every decade of unmanaged pressure. Type B, metabolically flexible, with an immune system that can quietly lose its footing. Each one has a trade-off, but type AB is different, not because it escapes that pattern, because its trade-off may be the most consequential of all. Type AB is the rarest blood group in the world. It emerged latest in human evolutionary history. A biological fusion that carries antigens from both type A and type B, creating an immune profile that is genuinely unlike any other. In some areas, that translates to real advantages. Type AB individuals tend to show lower inflammatory reactivity in certain immune contexts. Their bodies sometimes tolerate a broader antigenic range with less aggressive response. For a long time, researchers assumed that made type AB one of the more resilient profiles. Then a study was published in the journal Neurology that changed that assumption entirely. The researchers found that individuals with type AB blood showed a significantly higher likelihood of cognitive impairment later in life compared to every other blood group. Not marginally higher, significantly. And the mechanism was not what most people would expect. It was not large strokes. It was not dramatic neurological events. It was not the kind of brain damage that shows up suddenly and unmistakably. It was microcirculation, tiny blood vessels deep inside the brain, microscopic shifts in flow, subtle inflammatory changes accumulating in the smallest vascular channels, thus the ones responsible for keeping neural tissue consistently oxygenated, nourished, and metabolically stable over decades. Small vessel disease, silent, invisible on most standard scans until it has already been progressing for years. And here is what makes that so difficult to sit with. The brain does not send pain signals when its circulation begins to decline. There is no alarm, no obvious moment where everything changes. There is just a processing speed that imperceptibly slows, a memory that becomes slightly less reliable, a mental sharpness that used to feel effortless beginning to require just a little more effort than it once did. Things you would never call a symptom on any given Tuesday. Until enough Tuesdays have passed, and by then, the vascular aging that drove it has already been running quietly for a decade or more. This is the part of the longevity conversation that almost never gets said clearly enough. Your brain ages through its blood supply long before your behavior changes, which means protecting cognition is not something you do after symptoms appear. It is something you do now, in the years when nothing feels wrong yet, because that window is exactly when intervention still has the power to matter. Type AB carries a remarkable biological history, but remarkable does not mean invulnerable, and the cost of not knowing that is measured in years you cannot get back. Here is something worth pausing on. Everything we have covered so far, the cardiovascular profile of type O, the stress biology of type A, the immune vulnerability of type B, the cognitive risk carried by type AB, all of it has been built around one variable. Your ABO blood group, the letter. But there is a second part of your blood type that most people know even less about. A part that sits quietly alongside the letter, shapes immune behavior in its own distinct way, and almost never gets discussed in any meaningful health conversation. The Rh factor. You already know it exists. It is the positive or the negative that follows your blood type letter. O positive, a negative, B positive, AB negative. Most people learned it once and never thought about it again. But researchers examining immune signaling, inflammatory sensitivity, and long-term disease risk have found that the Rh factor is not simply a compatibility footnote. It is a biological variable with its own downstream consequences. Here is what the science shows. Rh-negative individuals carry a fundamentally different surface protein profile on their red blood cells compared to Rh-positive individuals. And that difference does not stop at surface chemistry. It appears to extend into how the immune system signals, how it responds to perceived threats, and how sensitively it reacts to inflammatory triggers over time. Studies examining cytokine response patterns, the chemical signals your immune system uses to coordinate inflammation, have found measurable differences between Rh-positive and Rh-negative individuals in how aggressively those signals fire under stress. What that means in practical terms is this. Two people can share the same ABO blood group and still carry meaningfully different inflammatory profiles simply because one is positive and the other is negative. Same letter, different biological terrain, and yet the overwhelming majority of people optimizing their health, tracking their nutrition, managing their supplements, monitoring their sleep, have never once factored their Rh status into that picture. They know their letter, they do not know their complete profile, and that gap matters. Because longevity research is increasingly moving away from broad population averages and towards something far more precise. Personalized biology, individual risk mapping, the understanding that generic health advice built for everyone is ultimately optimized for no one. Your ABO group tells one part of the story, your Rh factor tells another, and together they form a biological portrait that is specific to you, one that has been present since birth, influencing how your body responds to stress, manages inflammation, and ages under pressure, whether you were aware of it or not. Most people spend years chasing the right supplement, the right diet, the right morning routine, while one of the most fundamental pieces of their own biology sits on a medical record somewhere, unexamined and unconsidered. One day your family may wish you had paid attention to your health sooner, instead of assuming you had more time. Subscribe now, because understanding how your body actually works is not optional information. It is the difference between aging on your own terms and being blindsided by damage that was never inevitable. So, here is where everything lands. We have spent this entire conversation inside the science, the clotting proteins, the stress hormones, the immune dysregulation, the microvascular changes in the brain, the Rh factor sitting unexamined on a medical record most people have not looked at in years. And if you have been listening carefully, you may have felt something building underneath all of it, a quiet unease, the sense that your body has been running a program you were never fully briefed on. That is not an accident. That unease is useful. It is the feeling of information landing somewhere it actually matters. But here is where the conversation has to make a turn. Because none of the research we discussed tonight, not a single study, not a single finding, says your blood type is your destiny. Not one. What the science reveals are tendencies, predispositions, biological patterns that increase the probability of certain kinds of damage under certain kinds of conditions. And there is an enormous difference between a predisposition and an inevitability. This is where epigenetics enters the picture. Epigenetics is the field of science examining how lifestyle and environment influence the way genes actually express themselves. And what researchers in this field have demonstrated, repeatedly across large populations, is that daily behavior has the power to modify how aggressively genetic risk unfolds over time. Your genes load the gun. Your habits decide whether it ever fires. A type A individual who protects sleep, controls cortisol, and monitors cardiovascular markers consistently may biologically outperform a type O individual who ignores every signal their body sends for 30 years. A type AB individual who prioritizes blood pressure management, metabolic health, and vascular protection may preserve cognitive function far longer than the population statistics would predict. The biology is not the final word. It is the starting point for a smarter conversation. And that reframe changes everything about how you should approach the years ahead. Because the people who age the hardest are almost never the people who carried the most genetic risk. They are the people who carried risk they never understood, and therefore never addressed, until the damage had already compounded beyond the point where early action could have changed the outcome. The people who age the best are not the people with perfect blood types or flawless genetics. They are the people who learned their body's specific vulnerabilities early enough to work with them instead of unknowingly against them. That is the real longevity equation, not fear, not fatalism, awareness followed by action. So, let me ask you something before you go. What is your blood type? And looking back honestly at your own health history, the fatigue, the inflammation, the stress, the digestive issues, the moments where your body felt like it was working against you, does any of what we discussed tonight explain patterns you have been living with for years? Leave your blood type in the comments. I am Dr. James Cross, and the people who find this channel early are almost always the ones who are glad they did. Thanks for watching all the way through. Staying informed is key to living a healthier, longer life. If you want more simple, practical health advice, make sure you subscribe and tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a comment and rate this from 1 to 10. Your feedback helps me create better guidance for you.